Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, wherever you are in the world. I'm Karen Tokars. I'm a professor at Washington University in St. Louis, the director of the Negotiation and Dispute Resolution Program, and the director of the Civil Rights and Mediation Clinic. Thank you all so much for joining us for this conversation about 303, our second this summer. Before we get started, special thanks to Christine Marte, lead consultant for the Cultural Intelligence Center in Michigan, who has been assisting us with these discussions. And special thanks also to Alyssa Lackey, the Senior Managing Director for Clinical and Experiential Programs at Buffalo Law School, who created the 303 repository, which you will hear about later, the link to which is in the chat. Our goal for today is to create a forum to share standard 303A, B, and C best practices, a discussion which hopefully will be ongoing throughout this coming year and many years into the future. This is an exciting time. Since I posted an inquiry on the clinic and externship listservs about 2.5 months ago, inquiring what folks were doing around 303, over 125 folks responded with questions and suggestions. Clearly, 303 is not just another standard. Many of us see 303 as a unique transformative moment in legal education, a chance to influence not just the curriculum, law schools, but academia. And this is a unique transformative moment in legal education that we want to capture and maximize. So our hope is to encourage all of us to work throughout the curriculum, throughout our law schools, and throughout legal academia to be as creative and fearless as we can be as we embark upon what we see as an opportunity to radically change both the curriculum and underlying curricula and underlying goals of legal education. Today, 10 faculty, staff, and administrators from across the country, young, middle, and senior in experience, will share with you their perspectives and experiences relative to the 303 mandates. The discussions will share with you efforts they are making in their clinics, externships, experiential courses, skills courses, professional responsibility, other 1L and upper class courses, 1L orientations everywhere throughout the curriculum, and more broadly throughout all aspects of their schools to include and increase the focus on professional identity, bias, cultural competency, and humility, and racism in legal education. Our goal is to provide an overview of a range of strategies being utilized, as well as descriptions of specific offerings to provide examples of ways to adapt what others may be doing and create new opportunities that we can share with each other. I mentioned we see this as an ongoing discussion, a movement, if you will, where we are all as creative and fearless and energetic as possible. Following the brief presentations, there will be a short period of time for Q&A. Please put your comments in the chat. So real briefly from my part, I'm going to just mention briefly what's happening here at Washington University here in St. Louis. Like your schools, I'm sure many of our clinics, our externships, our experiential courses, our skills courses, our first year and upper class courses, orientation. There is a focus on 303. It might not be as explicit as it could be, but I'm just going to highlight one very small example to try to make the point that hopefully every course throughout the curriculum will begin to highlight these issues in one form or another. In the repository, I included the syllabus for a 1-credit required negotiation course, which we offer in August and during intersession in January for 1Ls. It's taught in 4 or 5 days, but one of those days has always focused on cultural competency. This is year 13 for this course. By no means does this wholly address 303, not at all. But my point of mentioning it is just to highlight the point I made earlier, that every course throughout the curriculum can and hopefully will address 303 in one way or another. So it is fluid throughout the curriculum and hopefully fluid throughout the law school culture and atmosphere. This course syllabus is in the repository that was created by Alyssa and the folks at Buffalo. And if you haven't done so, we encourage you to start posting anything that you have along these lines so that we can all share from each other. So each of the remaining discussants will speak for about 5 minutes, and we're going to save questions for the end, but please put them in the chat. Okay, we're going to hear from Kendall Carew. Many of you probably know, a clinical professor and director of externships at Georgia State Law School. She served for 5 years on the CLIA Advocacy Committee. She's now a fellow at the Halloran Center. She's going to talk both about the evolution and the hopes for 303, as well as some of her own experiences with implementation. Kendall.
Okay, thank you so much, Karen. First, I just wanted to kind of highlight, I think generally in very basic terms, the what, when, and how with respect to 303C in particular, because that is the standard that we are focusing on today, and the intersection that it has with standard 303B, which is the new standard B3 on professional identity formation, and standard 303A. All of you have, I'm sure, looked at the standard, read it carefully, but I wanted to highlight a few things. The first is, of course, the what, which I think we're all aware of, which is to focus on the three concepts of cross-cultural competency, bias, and racism. We are charged with educating our students on those. And then the when are we to do this? It's at the two different times, first at the beginning of the program of legal education, and then again, at least one more time before graduation. I wanted to highlight that there's one limitation on that second time, and that's that it must take place before or concurrent with their enrollment in a clinic or an externship course. This means that if you have a clinic or an externship course or program that runs over the course of a student's summer after their 1L year, then that educational opportunity, that second educational opportunity, must happen before or concurrent with that particular experience. So that can impact different clinics and externship programs that have that particular opportunity for rising 2Ls. Also, with respect to the professional responsibility course, if you teach professional responsibility, one thing that hasn't really been made aware to people, I think because it's not part of the standard main language, it's in an interpretation, is its intersection with 303C, and that is an interpretation 303.6. It says that with respect to 303A1, the importance of cross-cultural competency to professionally responsible representation and the obligation of lawyers to promote a justice system that provides equal access and eliminates bias, discrimination, and racism in the law should be among the values and responsibilities of the legal profession to which students are introduced. So if you are one who teaches a professional responsibility class that complies with 303A1, that is something to be made aware of and to incorporate when you are teaching the values of the profession. The how, there is no one way to comply with standard 303C. That's why we're here today. But all law schools must demonstrate that they have provided substantial activity to reinforce both cultural competency and the obligation as future lawyers to work to eliminate racism in the legal profession. At the same time that standard 303C was passed, and that was inspired by and prompted by a letter that was received by 150 law school deans, the council also added a new standard 303B3 that focused on professional identity formation. And that says that a law school shall provide substantial opportunities for development of a student's professional identity, and professional identity formation is defined in interpretation 303.5. I wanted to point that out because specifically it talks about professional identity formation really involving the intentional exploration of the values, guiding principles, and well-being practices considered foundational to successful law practice. So as stated in interpretation 303-6, those values include cross-cultural competency and eliminating racism and bias. So the intersection between professional identity formation, professional responsibility classes, and 303C is one that I just wanted to underscore. I'm going to go ahead and move on to how I've implemented this in my externship course. I have an externship course that is focused on professional identity formation. It's a 7-module series, and one of those modules is on cultural awareness. I start with the concept of culture as it relates to identity. We do a cultural identity exercise where students are to identify attributes that define their identity to them, not necessarily external attributes that others use to define them. We discuss cultural concepts such as geography and even being a law school student to try to get students comfortable with the idea of talking about culture and focusing on truly what that means to them and what their cultural lens is. We talk about implicit bias through videos and reactions and reflections on videos, including the neuroscience of implicit bias, which is put out by the ABA section of litigation. I have students take the implicit association test for race and age and reflect on that. I think a lot of people in the clinical community do that. I have students watch a TED Talk entitled, "What Does My Headscarf Mean to You?" We watch a video by Brian Stevenson, and really try to encourage students along the rest of the externship course to be thinking about and reflecting on how the lessons learned about culture are impacting the things that they are seeing and doing, and how that makes a lawyer effective or ineffective in their practice with respect to cultural differences. Finally, I just wanted to mention 2 resources that I've looked at. I also teach contracts in the first year, and I think that they're just invaluable to thinking broadly about this and how to integrate it within a doctrinal classroom, and that is Integrating Doctrine and Diversity, Inclusion and Equity in the Law School Classroom. Many of you have probably heard of this book, but I wanted to mention it, along with a free Aspen resource. It's a book written by Terry McMurtry-Chubb called Strategies and Techniques for Integrating Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion into the Core Law Curriculum. There's some specific examples in that book. Thank you.
And Kendall, I'm just going to ask you, hopefully you have or you will post all of those suggestions and references
Yes.
in that repository, so that people, I think a lot of people are going to be really interested in some of those
Okay.
materials.
I will. Thank you.
And on behalf of all of us, thanks for all the work you've done over the past 5 years to
Thank
push
you.
this important thing along. We're going to hear next from Diana Connolly, who, as you may know, Vice Dean for Advocacy and Experiential Education, Director of Clinical Education at Buffalo Law School, where she works with Alyssa Lackey, who created the repository. They have developed and already implemented the Buffalo model, where clinics and externships include an administrative run asynchronous required track on anti-racism, cultural humility, and belonging. And they have a forthcoming article in the Washington University Journal of Law and Policy. And they're going to tell us, or at least Diana's going to tell us a little bit about that.
Thanks everyone for being here. It is so great in the middle of August to see so many familiar faces or names when you're blank. So first, huge shout out to Alyssa Lackey, without whom all of this would not be possible. I'm just going to tell you a little about what we're doing at Buffalo, just to spark some ideas. I'm grateful to Karen for helping push us to publish an article that describes what we've been doing for a while. So our article is forthcoming. You can look for it on the resources page. It actually has not as detailed as Kendall could produce in her sleep, but it has a short overview and history of 303C that some people might find helpful. But the bulk of it shares what we've come to call, what other people are calling the Buffalo model, in a way that our clinical legal education and externship programs have started working with students to teach anti-racism, cultural humility, and belonging through our hashtag UB Law Responds program. We actually started the UB Law Responds program and really started this work back in 2017 when we really started diving into some of these materials, and we started sending students to Puerto Rico and Mexico and doing some interesting stuff. So we started this informally. But in the middle of 2020, when we were really in the nationwide discourse about race and inclusion and dealing with COVID. So we were both having these conversations and also figuring out how do we make students feel connected during COVID teaching. We developed an asynchronous online semester-wide track that every student who's enrolled in a clinic must participate in. And so the students enter, and in week 2, after they've settled into their classes, the students start into this space where they're going in a workspace that's curated on our university shared, we use UB Learns, which is just a shared space that all students have access to, and all the clinic students are put together, and all the externship students will be put together starting this fall. And we have to call this track Anti-Racism, Cultural Humility, and Belonging. We have some basic readings, kind of similar to what Kendall was talking about. We're going to be sharing some of those on the website and in our forthcoming article, just so you can see what we're doing, but we're not finalizing our list because we know we're going to learn more from this community and be adding. We have some basic stuff that the students have to do their first semester. For continuing students, or for students to take both an externship and a clinic, we have upper level stuff, or for people who are farther along in their journey and looking for more than they've already learned before. We have gradated things that we offer. Let me just say one thing that makes this possible is not just that I get to work with the amazing Elisa Lackey, but what makes this possible is great support from our administration, great support from our dean in making sure that we have the administrative capacity to help with this. It would be hard if it was just a small space with only professors, because this is something that the professors teach the stuff in their own clinics. Lots of us teach stuff integrated in the space that it makes sense for our clinics, which is different when you're teaching an environmental clinic, when you're in environmental justice, when you're teaching a criminal clinic, when you're looking at incarcerated folks, when you're teaching a family violence clinic. These are different spaces. So we all still teach our own stuff in our classes, but this track is where everybody gets an experience that really makes sure that the power of this is created in that space. So all clinics students work together in this and can reflect together. They're not mandated to reflect together, but can get into discourse, moderated discourse in this shared space over the course of the 12 weeks of the semester. And so it's really interesting to see. We've had great student feedback. We had a group that started this, that really started with 2 professors of color that brought us together on this. We've had a lot of input from folks on getting these materials, including continuing students who said, one of them said, hey, why don't you have anything detailed on the Haudenosaunee, the peoples who live on the land that we're inhabiting at the University of Buffalo? And so we added some of that. So we're viewing this as a space that we are going to continue to add and grow through, and are delighted that our students are leaning into that as well. So we are recognizing that this article that we are publishing, that we're making available to you, is very early in the conversation of what are we as a clinical community and a law professor community going to do about this new 303C model. We're offering this as a model. We're offering the additional resources, but we know that there are going to be people who come after us, and we know that we're going to learn from people as we go forward, and we're excited to do that. One other thing before I hand off is as a result of Karen and others inviting and learning from the folks who have been working on this in the other spaces, we have added some appendices that we hope will be helpful. We've added a 1-pager that kind of summarizes what we do, so that it can be something that people can grab if they don't want to read the whole article, which is not long. It's a kind of a short essay, longer than essay, but shorter than full article. So we have a 1-pager on what we do. We have another pager on the resources, another section appendix on the resources that we will build out, and we will have more resources available online in the shared space that our amazing IT folks are working with Elisa to create and curate. And we have another one because it turns out that one of the things that we find helpful is to talk with people about DEI is actually required in a number of states for CLEs. So we have a page that talks about the states and the increasing number of states that have DEI requirements as part of CLEs for practicing lawyers. And so those are the appendices that we've got in there. We're just excited that we are in a space to be working with our students, the students that we're going to be graduating from SUNY's Law School in Buffalo, to prepare them for the tradition of, being not just competent lawyers, but lawyers who are really, really fully educated in what justice, fairness, morality means in today's space. And so we look forward to the continuing improvement of the profession, look forward to hearing about how the clinics at our school and are working with our vice dean for DEI, and talking about how our clinical program can continue to interact in the tapestry, as Karen said, of school-wide presentation of these important resources. So happy to answer specific questions either by email after or in our conversation. And I'm going to turn it back over, and thanks again, everyone.
Thanks, Kim, Diana. I really appreciate that. And I think that we all share that energy. And it's great that you've integrated students from the beginning in the development of this, not just students, but also your administration all throughout the law school. Next, we're going to hear from Carwina Wang, recently of Indiana Law School. She is now a senior specialist for professional identity formation at the Law Student Admission Council. She has a deep interest in the development of professional identity and has a myriad of ideas and has been working on this for quite a while. She's going to talk about a couple of different instances: law school orientation, one book event, and an upper level experiential course on anti-racism and beyond. And I would urge you, if you have questions about just about any piece in your curriculum, find Carwina at some point, because she's touched every piece.
Thank you so much, Karen. And hello, everyone. My name is Carwina. I have she pronouns, I should say. Apologies. I'm still trying to get the language correct. As Karen said, I'm now at the Law School Admission Council, where I'm working on professional identity formation issues and programming. LSAC is hopefully soon going to be announcing some products that will be available to all law schools in this realm. And I want to say that I think of, and LSAC thinks of professional information very broadly, much the way Kendall was talking about. So everything really in 305 is connected to and falls within professional identity formation. This is who you are as a lawyer, how you're going to integrate who you are with the values, competencies, et cetera, of the profession. When we're focusing on 303C, looking at what efforts we want our students to learn and be able to do for bias, cross-cultural competency, and anti-racism, part of what we have to do is to think about where are we really situating this within the broader professional identity formation piece, because as again, Kendall pointed out, the ABA says this is actually also part of professional responsibility. These are some of the core values of the profession. This is part of how we as individuals, both teachers, staff, students, other legal professionals, think about our identities within the legal profession. And then there's that more specific professional development part, which is this training we're giving to our students right now, and we ourselves are engaged in with this conference or this meeting to develop our skills to be able to teach and transmit this information to 303C in 303C. So one of the things that I do, and all the materials are in the resources page on at UB, is an orientation. And the information there is based on an orientation project that I was asked to present at Seattle University, where I was visiting last year. Seattle U takes racism and anti-racism very, very seriously. So they have a one-book project. And this past year, for orientation, the one book was The Color of Law, which is the history of housing segregation, whether it's actually de jure, government adjacent, private actors, you name it, it's in there. And it's a very incredibly rich history of information, data, and consequences. From that perspective, you've got the knowledge. What do I now know about the history of racism in housing segregation and housing policy and practices in the United States? The question for me as a clinician and as a law professor is, how do I take that knowledge and help students understand what lawyers can do with it? So I'm giving them professional development tools that will tell me how much they understand about the content they've been given. And the questions therefore that I used as prompts for orientation was, how do you use this information as an advocate? Right? We have this information, it's great. Tell me you really understand it by thinking about how you might explain it to Chief Justice John Roberts, to the mayor of your city, to your local real estate agent, whoever it is, and how you would advocate for housing justice using that information. So that to me is really sort of the question of what we're doing with 303C. Where do we want to situate the learning for our students? And that's one example. The other example is the upper division course. It's an experiential course called Anti-Racism and Beyond, Skills for Equitable Lawyering. I've taught that at Maurer in Indiana, as well as at Seattle U. The Seattle U version is the one that's on the resource page. But the idea there is that, again, we have to have certain specific skills to enable us to be more effective as advocates. And so this course really focused on a small group of students and me creating and co-creating a learning community that focuses on our own discovery of how we are racist implicitly, how we may have prejudices involving stereotypes, for example, with each other, and how our behaviors actually may reinforce racism in ways that we don't want and other forms of oppression. So in that class, we were really focusing a lot on developing empathy, developing deep listening and skills to center people, and developing responses individually and collectively to microaggressions. So when we see or hear or commit a microaggression, and this is really more one-on-one or not the whole macro system, which is the system of oppression like racism, but what do? If I'm the one who says something like I just did at the beginning, introducing myself, I use pronouns instead of my pronouns are, can we actually repair that? Right? That's one of the skills we have to do, and repair it sincerely as opposed to one of those non-apology apologies we see all the time. If I'm in a class with lots of different people, how do I make sure that the people who may feel the least welcome or the least invited to speak have that opportunity? Sometimes that's actually a question of introversion and shyness versus specific broader oppressive systems, but taking those into account and making sure perhaps that I structure the class, that's sort of like what the talking stick is, to make sure everybody is able to talk, or identifying people ahead of time that they're going to be asked to present so they can prepare or to think about something before they talk. But these are all skills that we have familiarity with. It's just making sure our students know that how to use them intentionally and habitually. So that's what those two classes are. And I hope that if you have any questions, you will reach out to me. I'll pop my new email into the chat. I think I also did put it on the resources though. And you can also still find me on the Lachlan listserv because I keep hold of all of my listservs for as long as I possibly can. And that's another thank you to Kendall, who runs many of them.
Carwina, would you repeat the name of your courses? I've had two questions about the exact names, and so they'll be able to find them on the resource page.
I think it's listed under as Wang Anti-Racism and Beyond. But anything that has my last name in the title will be something that I put up there.
Okay. And that reminds me to comment, I'm not sure that Kendall mentioned this. Kendall has a chapter on building your professional identity in a book, Lawyering from the Inside Out. Kendall, if you didn't already, I would suggest posting that on the repository as well. Thank you. Okay, so now we're going to hear from Shirley Cruz. She teaches the advocacy clinic at University of Tennessee Law School in Knoxville. She also teaches cross-cultural competency. And as some of you know, she has a challenge that others of you may also have, and how they're doing a workaround in that regard. Shirley.
Thank you, Karen. Welcome and good afternoon to everyone. So as Karen has mentioned, as Kim has mentioned, clinics are playing a huge role in this process, right? And so we are leading the charge with regards to guidance, development, and assessment of these new ABA standards with experiential learning classes, with our externships, with our 1L classes, and our upper level classmates curriculum as well. To really reframe and formally identify the work that we really have been doing for a really long time, but we're sort of acknowledging it and cataloging it. It has been a little bit of a gift to us, this new ABA standard, for those of us who are in divisive concept states, because if you don't know, so the divisive concept law, at least in Tennessee, prohibits mandatory training, seminars, workshops, orientation of students and employees on divisive concepts, which broadly includes privilege, implicit bias, systemic structural racism, sexism, all of the things that matter and that our students need to be learning and talking about and doing with regards to lawyering. So the ABA standards gives us some protection because the prohibition does not include, the prohibition against teaching these things are not included if there's a mandatory requirement to comply with academic accreditation. So this requirement from the ABA sort of gives us this gift of an umbrella with regards to the accreditation requirements. So we are grateful for it in allowing us to continue to do the work. With regards to clinic, we have been incorporating this work in our all clinic orientation throughout the semester. At Tennessee, we collaborate with the social work school and a student who's a master in social work who helps us develop a curriculum with regards to well-being, mindfulness, and in addition to general social work support. In our all clinic orientation, which is an all-day event where we meet together as all of the practice areas clinics, but then separately in the afternoon, individually within practice areas, there's pre-orientation assignments that include readings, videos focused on narratives and assumptions with regards to identity, cross-cultural humility, implicit bias. There's an emphasis that throughout the clinic from day one, we are going to be exploring these topics. We're going to be talking about it. It matters, with that focus on assumption, bias, intersectionality. The pre-clinic orientation materials are posted on the website, but they include the danger of a single story, 3 myths about racism, Urban Institute reports about disparities, racial disparities and equities, articles on Kimberly Crenshaw's video of a really basic definition of what intersectionality means, again, sort of based on where we're situated. So it's a 101, how racism makes us sick. So a lot of really rich readings that they have to do prior to the all-day orientation. And then during orientation, we break up into subgroups and we discuss them. They have prompts. We really get into what does this mean? What things surprised you? What challenged you? What do you want to learn more about? How do we use this information to have a new perspective? And there's a call to action. How can we incorporate this in the work that we're doing with the clinic? The Master Social Work student is part of clinic orientation. So from day one, again, wellness matters, well-being matters. We're talking about it there. She's part of the program. With regards to 1L and upper level classes, we include in our 1L orientation topics of personal identity and cultural humility. And there's also a required 1L class called Lawyering and Professionalism that we've had since 2016. That's required for all 1Ls. It's taught right now by our Associate Dean of Academic Affairs, who also brings in tenured track faculty and guest speakers. The 1 credit course, it meets 7 times. It's not graded, so it's on a satisfactory no credit. It's a 1L course, but the focus really is career path, self-awareness, cross-cultural humility, basic lawyering skills so that the students can better understand what it means to be a lawyer, what kinds of lawyers do they aspire to be, and they draft a professional plan that sort of incorporates all of these things. In our upper level experiences, we have 2 courses. We have Lawyers as Leaders and Thriving as a Lawyer. The Lawyers as Leaders course has been around since 2012, previously taught by the Dean of the Law School, and explores professional leadership, public service, redefining success, leaving a proud legacy, and practical ethics in lawyering. In that class, we bring in, again, guest speakers, alumni to sort of create that plan. Our second course that we offer as an elective and that course is 2 credits and graded. The second course that we offer as an upper level elective, also 2 credits and graded, is taught by an alumni, and she has a master's in applied positive psychology, which I think is just so cool. And so she is able to use scientific principles about positive psychology and how they foster well-being. It's designed as a 3-day intensive over the weekend course for our students, which I think is also really attractive to sort of have this intensive course for the students where they focus on strengthening positivity, what that means for having a meaningful career, improved well-being, greater resilience, having this sort of wellness mindset as you're practicing as an attorney, and tons of amazing readings about why lawyers are unhappy, obstacles to thriving in the law, how we can provide our highest quality lawyering despite all of the pressures of being a lawyer, strategies for best practices, and sort of changing the culture of the profession. So that's one that if I could audit, I would audit. It just sounds really cool. And then I posted on the website additional materials that I've presented along with a cohort who's sort of been presenting on this topic for a few years, Jamie Langowski, Catherine Laraya, Karen Mitchell-Munavar, and Kelly Riera, on other specific topics that might be interesting to the group with regards to implicit bias, thinking about mistakes, allyship, cross-cultural communication. So there are videos, there are readings and things that you can sort of incorporate into your curriculum. Thank you. I think my 5 minutes maybe.
So Shirley's comments remind me to suggest to folks that if you can, it might be helpful if you have multiple courses as Tennessee does, to, in addition to posting them separately, to post an overview of the curriculum, courses A, B, C, D, E, F, G, so that one school could compare and contrast, perhaps use it with their dean. There will be schools that say, well, we've got one course. And I think that the ultimate goal is to try to make this as broad as possible. And so for many of you who have multiple courses, I would say try to list this overview so that people can compare and contrast all the way from the orientation through graduation. I think that would be really helpful. Next, we're going to hear from Brian Adamson. He's a very experienced clinical faculty member, many of you know, and he's currently the Associate Dean for Diversity and Inclusion at Case Western. Brian.
Thank you, Karen. Thank you for inviting me to this program. It's so wonderful to see familiar faces, people who I love and adore and respect and admire, and some new faces. And I'm not in the clinical world anymore, but just like today, I'm always invigorated by these sessions, by these workshops, whenever I'm with clinicians, because just what I've been hearing over the last few minutes have been so inspiring, and just admire the thoughtfulness and the experience and that you've brought to all of this. And many of you have been working in this space long before it was even mandated. So many props and respect to all of you. I wanted to just briefly talk about one thing and touch upon a second thing that we're doing here, not necessarily in the clinical space, but you might hear the second thing I'm going to talk about touches upon experiential opportunities for our students. So for the last 3 years, or last 2 years, going into the third year, we've offered a one-year elective called Race, Law, and Society. And that seminar is a 1 credit, pass no credit seminar. And it allows students to explore the ways in which systemic inequities manifest themselves in our legal spaces, our social, economic, and political and cultural institutions. And the distinction, the approach that we decided to take here is that we would not assign case law or law books for students, but instead I would curate documents that are not related to law, and then faculty members would select what document they wanted to teach, and then they would have a seminar on that document. And so each year, the theme around Race, Law, and Society was different. So in our first year, it was race. And so, for example, amongst the curated documents, faculty members picked The New Jim Crow, Alex Fatale's The End of Policing, Ta-Nehisi's Coates, Between the World and Me, How to Be an Anti-Racist. I taught that one. Pauli Murray's autobiography, Songs for a Weary Throat, Dorothy Roberts' Killing the Black Body, and so on and so forth. Students enroll, and it is a seminar that they spend time reading and discussing the document that they've chosen. In the second year, this past year, the theme was gender. And so I taught from Toni Morrison's Beloved. Another one of my colleagues, Aisha Hardaway, taught Kenitra Brooks's The Lemonade Reader, based on Beyonce's Lemonade album. Someone else taught Isabel Wilkinson's The Warmth of Other Suns, Infidel by Ann Hersey Ali, Racialized Bodies, Disabling Worlds, and so on. This year is focused on Indigenous peoples. And so some of us will be teaching, or I will be teaching, for example, Plagues and Peoples. Another professor will be teaching The Heartbeat of Wounded Knee. Another professor will be teaching an Indigenous people's history of the United States, Covered with Night by Nicole Eustache, and so on and so forth. So it's in a way in which to get students engaged in the law and looking at the law from a particular lens once they or as they are going through reading and reviewing, discussing these documents. In addition to the seminar, there is a once a month program where an expert, a faculty member comes in and touches upon or talks about a topic that touches upon the themes that the course is intending to surface. So, for example, in the first year of looking at issues of race, we had someone come in, for example, and talk about the history of housing discrimination in the city of Cleveland. And so that's just one by way of an example. So that's one thing that we've done. Right now it's an elective, and we're currently doing our assessment to determine what we might make mandatory. We do have a 1L orientation on DE&I, and cultural intelligence and cultural humility that's required of all 1Ls, but we're looking at other ways to make that happen. And so that's race, law, and society. The second thing I wanted to just touch upon briefly was what we're going to be offering coming this fall. And so I've been developing for the last 2 years this Academy for Inclusive Leadership Development. And this arose really like in 2020 and with the racial reckoning of 2020. Where not only law schools, but law firms and other corporate organizations were trying to come to terms with all of these issues, the intractable racial, ethnic, gender inequities that not only exist in society, but exist within their own spaces and legal organizations, particularly as it regards, hiring, promotion, and retention of their lawyers. And, we know that legal organizations, they have wholesale positions on to address these issues, DE&I officers in law firms, et cetera. Some of them do. And law schools, right? We've always had this obligation, and now 303 has made it imperative that we really explore and examine these issues that were brought to bear regarding bias and racism, as well as professional identity. And so we started developing this academy about 2 years ago, but of course, 303 kind of made it imperative, or at least enhanced the importance of it. And this academy is designed to educate and empower not only just lawyers to more effectively take on roles in legal organizations that they go to, the strength or that they're in, to strengthen their DE&I and belonging efforts, right? And so the academy is a multi-session, a 17-session program held over 7 months. It's both live and it's virtual. Sexual orientation, ability, ethnicity lines, the science of bias, cultural intelligence and humility, leadership and self-assessment and professional identity formation, transformational leadership, developing strategic plans. A whole host of topics are covered over these 17 sessions. And they're facilitated not only by professors, but by legal experts, with extensive experience in DEI and B training. The students will enroll as a cohort, and lawyers will enroll as a cohort, but there will be opportunities for them to cross dialogue. Students at the end of it will be able to get a certificate and also have it noted on their transcript. So it gives them an added, not only experience and skills, but it also gives them something else to talk about. It supplements and augments their legal understanding, and that makes, I think, even more valuable to organizations. There'll be specialized readings and training tools and discussions on the Canvas platform that we're using. There'll be exercise and simulations. There's going to be high dialogue, high reflection opportunities that are built into this. And the experiential piece of this is that, once again, the tools and toolkits that the students and the lawyers are going to be given, they're going to be able to use and apply in their workspaces. They're going to be asked to take a real organization and do an analysis of their DE&I policies, to do an analysis of their hiring practices. They're doing analysis of the advertisement for lawyers, you know, to see whether the advertisement, you know, for example, it encourages inclusiveness or exclusiveness. And so that's what we're going to be doing with the Academy. And well, come this October, I'll post that. It's not in it now, but I'll post that for you. But I just want to thank you for your time. And I'm happy to ask any questions offline or after this. Thank you.
Brian's comments remind me also to mention that in addition to each of us, to the degree we can, documenting the various areas in which our law schools are addressing this issue, is there a way that, or how are law schools going to certify or verify that students are really getting this? Many of the courses are, some are required, but many are electives. And how our school is going to do an overview of the entire picture to make sure that every student gets this, and how much does each student need to get. The ABA has not quantified that yet. And Kendall and others may have a sense of where they might go. There was some talk early on that it might be as much as 1 full credit, but that did not get, didn't materialize in the standards. Okay, so we're going to move on to Rick Petrie. He is the Director of Diversity and Inclusion at Mitchell Hamlin.
Hey, thank you. It's good to be here with everybody this afternoon, this evening, this morning, whatever time of the day it is, wherever you may be in the world. Here at Mitchell Hamlin, I and others in our law school have been doing this type of training for a couple of years. One of the ways that I approached it was based on some early trainings that we did that didn't work very well. And what I mean by that is we got a lot of pushback from students saying things like, why in the world do we have to do this? This doesn't have anything to do with me being a lawyer. I'm not paying money to come here and to hear this type of stuff. And so in response to that, I started thinking about, well, is that right? Or is there more to it? And what I came up with was there are actually some very relevant things that have to do with day-to-day skills that lawyers need that can be taught using this type of training. And one of the things that we saw was very early on, a lot of pushback. Oh, you're going to talk about unconscious bias, which I take to be just a code word for calling me a racist. And so we wanted to get beyond simply unconscious bias and get into some of these skills. And so here's what we came up with. We did a number of trainings, one that focused on cognitive biases, for example, not just unconscious bias. If you look at cognitive biases as a whole, at least based on what we know right now, there are over 188 cognitive biases that every human being has. Simply having cognitive biases doesn't mean that you're a racist, but not being aware of cognitive biases as a lawyer can get you into all sorts of messes. And so we started looking at that, and we looked at things like, just unconscious bias, but I use that and I would just talk about it, put it on the table and get it out of the way. We also talked about things like confirmation bias, the illusory truth effect, which can be a real problem for a lawyer, right? You keep repeating this, or your client keeps repeating it, or somebody keeps repeating it, and all of a sudden you believe it to be the truth. Or worse yet, maybe it gets repeated to a jury or a judge, finder of fact, and just because they've heard it so many times, they start to believe that it's the truth, when in reality, it's not. It's just a cognitive bias showing up. The illusory of validation is another bias that we looked at. False memory is another bias that we looked at. Consistency bias, the recency illusion, which is another real problem. So here's an example, right? We're in a trial, and just because I happen to be the last one to talk about a particular issue, does that mean that the recency illusion sets in with a judge or a jury, whoever it might be? And if I leave that bias unchecked, does that leave them with a false impression about what the actual law is, what the facts are, what the conclusions are that can be drawn from the facts or the law? All of those things. We also talked about the Dunning-Kruger effect and the Pygmalion effect. So a number of biases. We went beyond just talking about unconscious bias, and we looked at a lot of other things.
Rick, can you clarify for us what courses you're talking about that people might want to replicate?
Yeah, absolutely. So we have done just, I guess maybe by way of background, at our school, we have a 6-hour requirement that all students from the time they come into school until the time they graduate, they have to complete 6 hours of diversity, equity, and inclusion training. And so we have these standalone training programs that we offer throughout the school year. Then in addition to that, for a number of years, I ran our legal residency program, which is sort of like externship that's expanded. It's a semester-long, full immersion experiential program. And so in that particular program, we would talk about these things, it sort of on the on-ramp to the person getting involved in the experiential learning opportunity. And it might be with a judge, it could be at a law firm, it could be any place where they would get a full immersion experience. Also in our clinical, our regular clinicals, we have a number of different clinical operations. I think my colleague Carolyn Gross is going to speak later, and I'll let her speak more specifically to the various clinical offerings that we have. But we've done it in a number of different ways. I'll give you another example. We're located in St. Paul, Minnesota, which you may or may not know, but is right across the river from Minneapolis, where the whole George Floyd murder took place. And so then we offered a couple of specific opportunities. We put on a class called Police as Defendants. And it was really an interesting class. We did this not this summer, but the summer before last. And in that class, just as students opted in, it was a summer course, we wound up with about a third of the students that were either currently involved in law enforcement or had previously been involved in law enforcement. About another third of the class came into the class red hot against the police. They thought that either police should be abolished or defunded or all sorts of things anti-police. And then, of course, we had some students in the middle that were somewhat neutral. We used that class as an opportunity to talk about all of these different things. And it was a really beautiful unfolding of various perspectives. And as a lawyer, being able to see things from various perspectives is obviously critically important.
Thank you, Rick.
Critically important.
If you could post the whatever the I don't know what you would call it, the statement or the resolution that your faculty or rule that your faculty adopted. We're going to move to Liz Cooper. Liz is an experienced clinician, many of you know, and she is the faculty director of the Feerick Center for Social Justice at Fordham Law School.
Thank you so much, Karen. And many thanks to all of you for dedicating this time and to the group of people I've had the great good fortune of working with on these issues most recently and for a couple of years. So I come to you today in my role primarily as a clinician teaching the Legislative and Policy Advocacy Clinic at Fordham. And also as the person who's been the co-chair of our DEI committee for the last 2 years. And so my role here is twofold. One is to talk a little bit about what our law schools can do more generally, which may or may not fall within the bounds of the new ABA requirement, but what law schools can do more generally to be anti-racist institutions. And also to describe some of the actions we've taken more specifically within our clinical program to pursue the goal of being anti-racist within the clinic. So starting first with the bigger picture of law school-based actions. Like probably almost all of your law schools and universities, we have some people who are incredibly dedicated to being anti-racist and to eliminating, reducing racism and other forms of oppression. We also have some members of our community who are less supportive. And I think that part of this work that we're doing has to acknowledge that that's the environment in which we are acting. We're not going to magically change people from one direction to another overnight, but I'll come back to that at the end. It does help, however, to have a dean who is focused and dedicated to making change, and really, quite frankly, someone who can allocate necessary resources and personnel, someone who's willing to raise the money or spend money that already exists. In the early last year, I think it was, the school, maybe actually now it's 2 years ago, announced the Fordham Law School Anti-Racism Action Plan. And the dean has been communicating with the law school community, including our alums, about steps that we've taken forward on this mission regularly since this initiative was started. Its focus is threefold, which is increasing diversity, making the law school more inclusive and feelings of belonging, and addressing systemic racism. I'm not going to go into any details on all of this because 5 minutes is 5 minutes. From there, the dean hired an outside consultant to the law school with the guidance of faculty and staff, hired an outside consultant to do a racial climate study. And this person and their team surveyed faculty, students, administrators, and alums, as well as met in sort of focus groups with groups from subgroups of all of these populations. About a year later, maybe a little less, he provided us with the report, or they provided us with their report, and we made the decision to openly share it with the law school community. The idea was, we have warts, we've got issues, same as any other institution, mainstream institution, majority white institution, and let's be open about it, because doing so will allow us to identify better solutions. During the first year, last year, there have been initiatives that have been implemented slowly but surely over the last year. And our DEI committee is in the process of developing a strategic report that will more actively guide, we're hoping, short-term, middle-term, long-term goals in the following 4 areas. 1, faculty recruitment, hiring, retention, and development. 2, student recruitment, admission, support, and development. 3, curriculum reform and accountability. And 4, opportunity structures, which we think of like moot court, journals, clerkships. We're moving forward. I'm happy to keep you posted once we have our report in place. There are a couple of other schools that have done these as well. I'll shout out Duke Law School for having done a particularly good strategic report. In the meantime, just a couple of miscellaneous initiatives that we've taken on so far. There was a mandatory training of full-time faculty around racism in the classroom and how to be more of an anti-racist and how to better talk about race in the classroom, and an offering of that training to all adjunct faculty. We've had faculty-led workshops to share best practices and to discuss issues and concerns that have arisen in the classroom. And the dean has created a diversity advisory council composed of diverse students to ensure the students of color that they have access to the dean and senior deans on crucial issues. So jumping quickly to clinic-based actions. About a year or so ago, I've lost track, maybe it's 2 years actually, now that I'm thinking about it, we started our anti-racism steering committee in the clinic, composed of clinic faculty, clinic staff, clinic students, and clinic alums. And we've worked on 3 main issues in addition to a couple of others, working on climate issues affecting morale and well-being for support staff. We're starting to more aggressively explore the climate for students of color in the clinic. And we've talked about the clinic admissions process. Over this past summer, we've been working more aggressively, faculty, this is only faculty now, to assess and revise our syllabi to ensure that anti-racism is part of our case and project selection, our readings, both in terms of diversity of authors and substance taught, our in-class activities and discussions, and any homework assignments. Still in progress, happy to let you know how that all shakes out. Closing notes. The ABA has done something really important, and the more we can leverage the new requirements, I think the better off we are. I want to start with, end with one note about how things actually can change. When we started this work 2 years ago, when George Floyd's murder galvanized white people to more closely examine our own racism, and think about how we could address things in the law school. I heard any number of my colleagues express concerns about how they would talk about race in the classroom. Everything from my syllabus is already so full to I'm afraid I'll make mistakes and make the classroom atmosphere worse. But earlier this summer, I heard some of these same voices say things, well, of course it makes sense to talk about the racial context in which cases arise. So I can't say that the process has been seamless, but it feels good to make some movement. And I look forward to learning from other positive efforts other schools have been undertaking. Thanks so much.
Thank you for being so succinct and pushing all of that into the short 5 minutes. I think though your energy and exuberance parallels what Brian was saying and others have been saying. This is such a valuable time, such an exciting time, such a movement time that we just have to embrace it as zealously as we possibly can. We're going to hear next, I think, from Christine Marte, who I introduced at the beginning, who has been very helpful to us. She's the lead consultant for the Cultural Intelligence Center in Michigan, and she's been assisting us with these discussions. And then Carolyn Gross, and the two of them work together to some degree. So I'm going to leave it to them to figure out which comments they're going to make when and how. Christine?
Thank you, Karen. So looking at the time, I really want to be mindful about the fact that we did also want to create some space for people to have questions. So I'll try and summarize my comments to about 2 minutes so I can at least allow for Carolyn to also jump in. You may have heard Brian mention cultural intelligence earlier. And if that's not a terminology that's familiar to you, then I'd like to touch on that, and we can certainly provide more information through the resource link. Cultural intelligence, very simply put, is the capability to function and relate effectively in a culturally diverse situation. So even as we talk about this mandate that's been brought forward for 303, one of the questions that comes up, and I think Liz touched on that, Rick touched on it as well, is this comfort level, if I can use that term, of say faculty members to discuss these types of issues in the classroom. How would a person who's not familiar with it or comfortable with it, talk about it? So that's where we can start to talk about the skills that one might be able to build up in order to increase their comfort level with discussing matters of diversity, equity, and inclusion. So within the Cultural Intelligence Center, we really look at 4 capabilities that each one of us brings to the forefront. What's our interest or desire, or even our confidence to be in a multicultural situation? How much knowledge do we have about how cultures are similar or different? What strategies do we use to be effective in that multicultural interaction? And probably most important is, how do we show up? How do we behave when we're in that multicultural context, all right? So at the center, we have assessments that we use. These are all research-based, and many institutions, more than 250,000 people have taken our assessments. And pretty much what they do is they kind of give us this baseline of where we fall on that trajectory of our drive, our knowledge, our strategy, our action around multiculturalism. And then we work on an action plan. It's one thing to have lots of awareness about mindfulness, tolerance and ambiguity, behavioral flexibility, understanding what racism is, understanding what implicit biases are. We can have all that knowledge, right? But if we don't follow that with action, then it really doesn't amount to much, right? We can have it, but if we're not translating it into something beneficial for those multicultural interactions, then we continue to propagate a lack of inclusion, or we continue to propagate a lack of belonging. And so what the CQ Center does is really operate across 3 trajectories. We work with leadership. Liz mentioned earlier that they were in an instance where they brought in external consultants. So we come in as external consultants and work with leadership to really understand what's going on internally and what the opportunities might exist with regards to DE&I initiatives. we've also worked with faculty members to engage that whole process of becoming more culturally intelligent as an educator, so that there's an increased comfort level in discussing D&I issues, right? But we also work with students, where students can go through self-paced learning on implicit bias, on cultural intelligence. These are modalities that can be integrated with your learning management systems to enable the recipient, right? Whether that recipient is a dean, the college president, it might be a faculty member or the student, to really be able to measure the behavioral change, their action around diversity. So I'm going to stop there because I feel like I went way beyond my 2 minutes. I get excited about this type of conversation. But I want to thank you all for just making time for this discussion today, because I think that there's much that can be done, and I'm deeply encouraged by all of the wonderful opportunities and projects and initiatives that are already moving forward. With that, Carolyn, I'm going to pass it on to you to close us out with a Q&A and further discussion.
Thank you so much, Christine, and thank you for all of your work and your energy bringing us together. I'm not going to take the full 5 minutes. I just want to say a couple of things. There's been a lot of talk about professional development, and I think we started out, with this idea of 303 being this tool for professional development and in the frame of professional development. And then the last few speakers have brought us more to this question of our own professional development, our own comfort with talking about these things. And I just want to highlight the fact that just because we might have worked in this field for some of us decades, doesn't mean we know how to do this stuff. I know I can say I am not an anti-racism educator. I haven't been trained in this field, and I make mistakes a lot, and we all do. And I think it's really important that even those of us who have been doing this for decades acknowledge, and Karwina mentioned this, that particularly as white people, we are at risk of conflating our expertise as clinical pedagogues with expertise in cultural humility and cultural intelligence. I saw this great quote on one social media, I can't remember which it was, but saying it's not inclusion if you're inviting people into a space you're not willing to change. And I just want to really caution us to be humble about our own biases, about even a space like this. So I'm going to leave it there and open it up for Q&A, and just really encourage us all to be introspective as we go and do this very, very important work for our students, but also for ourselves and our community.